So for our next discussion, sticking with the topic of technology, we are going to be talking about disruptors. Namely, are the disruptors going to become the disrupted? I remember, as I mentioned earlier today, years ago they used to say that the fintech industry was being the disruptive one. And now, broadly, we've already seen many unicorns in the space. So, to help me unpack this topic and more, I'd like to invite our first panelist up on stage, who I hope are already sitting in the wings. Roberto Crocci, the head of Microsoft for Startups MEA. Kaustubh Wagle, the managing director and partner of BCG. And Haider Khan, the CEO of Bayut.com and head of EMPG MENA. So, to start with, disruptors becoming the disrupted. A lot of these companies that might have been disruptors to begin with, might have been startups, are now themselves large corporates. So, an interesting question, I think, to start with. How can large corporates help maintain that startup mentality? Roberto, perhaps we can start with you at the end and we'll run our way down.
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So I believe it starts from the top. It starts from the leadership and the culture that these organizations are able to set up within their own organizations, right? So we have seen the lifespan of Fortune 500 companies, for example, in the recent years has constantly been reducing. Why is that? Why so many organizations have not been able to reinvent themselves to see some of the market shifts happening and thus sustain their business? At the same time, if you look at some of these companies that have been able to reinvent themselves, and you go back in their history, a lot of those, they didn't start in the same business model that they are in today. They were probably doing even completely different things. But at some point in their history, they've been able to see the shift happening and do something to sustain their business for us, right? So where does it start from? To me, it starts from the fact that these organizations have been able to build sort of an ambidextrous sort of culture where they're able to exploit the core business. I mean, the money is coming at the end of the day out of that, right? But at the same time, building an alignment and culture and organization that allow them to explore new things and be ready to at the time when the time comes, right? So this is just a starting point, I would say.
Well, we can unpack that in a minute. Kaustubh, same question for yourself.
No, I think that's a great question. First of all, it's super important that corporates do that, right? Look, at the end of the day, why is that important even, right? In this next decade, the success mantra for big tech, or any company for that matter that's involved with tech, is going to be the ability to look around the bend to seize the next wave of innovation, right? While watching one's flank for the disruptors. So it's super important, right? And how do you do that? To answer your question, how do corporates maintain that mindset of startups, right? Look, first of all, it starts with establishing innovation and digital as a priority for a corporate, right? And declaring that across your company. Now, how do you actually make that happen, right? We find there are different ways to do this. First of all, structurally, corporates set up dedicated startup and innovation units, namely corporate venture capital funds. Like, for example, Microsoft has M12. Here in the region, Etisalat or EAND has recently launched a CVC fund. So that's one way to do it. The second structural way to do this is to create what we call corporate venture builders. These are units where the corporate, leveraging its assets, financial, non-financial, will look for white spaces and bridge that gap in the market, right? So these are corporates that are actually building startups within the organization. Great examples, locally here in the Middle East, we have Enoch launched the first pay-as-you-go insurance here that you might be aware of, Bima, which coincidentally was actually built by BCG Digital Ventures. So these are fantastic ways to inculcate that startup mindset. Now, the other question that you will really want to ask yourself is, yes, this allows you to create that startup mindset, but this might be precluded to a certain elite group of people or a small ring-fence people. How do you then make sure that this mindset is also manifested in the larger corporate? And for this, we really see two broad ways in which this can happen, right? One is you enforce, and the other is you empower. What do I mean by that? By enforce, this is really it's a push mechanism where you use mandates, KPIs, scorecards to ensure there's collaboration between this new unit and the rest of the organization. Or, which we generally prefer and we use often with our clients, is empower, where you make it a pull mechanism, you incentivize the full corporate, you get that excitement to make sure that the startup mentality is spread through the organization. And of course, beyond this, there are other mechanisms, right? There's digital transformations that are happening across industries. There's agile at scale. There are things like what Google does when it comes to like the 90-10, where 10% of your time you can spend on innovation, and so on and so forth, right? So many ways in which you can really accomplish this.
And then to Haider, similar question to yourself, especially considering the journey that your firm has been through over the last few years. How do you keep that startup mentality, and why is it important to do so?
So I think it's interesting, right? I mean, for us, we started up in the digital space. So we're not coming from let's say, a more traditional sector. I think, like my colleagues over here correctly pointed out, you have to have a very strong DNA around innovation. When you're in the digital space, you are trying to disrupt a lot of the existing business models. But then there are others in the digital space who are trying to disrupt you. So how do you keep up on both fronts? And that's a challenge. And you cannot do it unless a couple of things. One is you need to have a very good understanding of what problem are you really solving. It's a lot. You can produce a lot of products, but if people don't use them, they're worthless. So do you really understand where the market is? I was listening to you in the previous session, you're talking about the metaverse and AI and all that. This is not the first, let's say, birth of AI. This is the third kind of reincarnation of AI. The theory has been around for the last 40 years. But now is the time where you have enough data, where you have enough computing power to be able to do something with it. So you have to have a very good pulse of where the market is. You have to think 5-10 years ahead. And you always need to be that needs to be your kind of Northern Star. You have to be building for that. And you need to have a very good understanding of, okay, if you build something that's 10 years out now, that's not going to be adopted. Without adoption, you're not going to see anything. So, and it starts from the top. You have to have that mindset. And I personally believe that I follow the kind of the mantra, which is you build and they'll come, but don't build for 20 years out. Although that would be pretty awesome. But I think I'll be the only one using it, or maybe a few other people. Anyway, that's.
I've always looked at the startup culture as part of the important reasons behind it is about increasingly keeping innovation at the heart of doing business and building new products. That being said, if we are increasingly seeing consolidation in the technology space as larger corporates come together, whilst maybe maintaining their own startup culture, where do we see innovation going? What is going to happen to innovation? And Haider, perhaps we could stick with you on this.
Sure. So I think one of the fundamental challenges, right, in the early days of a startup, you are mostly spending to build something, to acquire traffic, or whatever the case might be. Which the landscape has changed a lot in the last 6 months on that front as well. But once you reach profitability, I think the challenge is, are you going to continue on that path, or are you going to reinvest it? Consolidation typically happens because it leads to further profits, frankly. If two companies come together, they don't have to do twice the work, and the bottom line improves. So the question, and which is a very fine balance to maintain, because once you start hitting profitability, it's you want more of it. So how do you keep a culture of innovation around? Even if you take Facebook as an example, a lot of their investment is going into the metaverse. Their stock fell because they lost a tiny bit of subscribers, but it mainly fell because of the huge amount of investment that's going into and people into metaverse, and people start discounting that. So it really, you have to find that balance, and you have to have the right backers if you're going to do that. Otherwise, it's just going to be a very tough road ahead.
Roberto, same question to you, I think, around how this relationship between innovation and consolidation and startups, where do you see that, the dichotomy of those together?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I agree. It's a matter of balance, right? So, and to me, it always starts from the fact that the focus should be on what are the real needs that users have. Because around that, it's where innovation really starts and where you start building new business models and new things, right? So let me give you an example because it's a very generic question. So in my experience, for example, at Google, when I joined Google 2008, I joined in a team. Google acquired a company called DoubleClick for $3.1 billion, right? So it was a media buying platform. Was that a consolidation? It was an acquisition, right? So that allowed Google to avoid disintermediation from third-party players. Did that kill the industry? Probably not. It allowed the industry to have thousands of players, media agencies building on IDs that were provided by DoubleClick as a platform, new channels, new devices, new experiences, right? So a number, hundreds of companies were created around that. And then we saw a round of consolidation. Why? Because sometimes for those smaller players, the unit economics didn't make sense, and they need to find a platform where they could have allowed more scale to reach out to more users and allow them to sustain their business, right? So it's cyclical to me, right? So sometimes when we have these disruptors, as you said, that come in with certain business model, they become platforms upon which there is more development of more solutions that the disruptor itself, they cannot build everything in-house, and then there is a sort of a consolidation round. Is it sustainable? It depends on the industry, probably. But definitely, in my opinion, again, to connect back to where I started from, is it really depends on, the focus should be where the user needs are, because around those is where, even if you are a disruptor, a big Google or Microsoft, chances are you might not be doing everything, right? And sometimes it's easier to start small, fresh, even outside of these companies that look innovative and build something that can scale and then eventually be consolidated, acquired, or turning out into a new platform and into a more established.
And Kaustubh, turning to you here, we did promise we'd talk about disruption. Are the technology giants being disrupted? Can you point to any examples of that in play?
For sure. Look, of course this is happening, right? And as I said at the start, it's about looking for what's next, but also protecting, your core business. And, look, let's talk about what are the kinds of disruption, right? And I'm happy to give a few examples of those as well. Broadly, I would say there are three types of disruptions that we are seeing in the market right now, right? First of all, disruption around the core business model and product offering. Now here, I can give you some examples of this, right? So first of all, it might be a nimble competitor coming up and finding a market friction or an opportunity to bridge that gap. For example, let's take TikTok, right? Short form videos. That was a new product offering, right? That was giving Meta platforms a bit of a run for their money, right? Another example or type of disruption around the product offering and the core business model would be if you think about a specific type of a segment, right? Or a category. So for example, in e-commerce, quick commerce, right? This is a relatively new concept. Or for that matter, groceries, where Delivery Hero is doing exceptionally well, right? Even though Amazon Fresh is prevalent there, in the US particularly. Or it could also be things like changes in the market dynamics, right? Let's say suppliers are going vertically integrated, and they give you a bit of a challenge. In OTT, for instance, like Disney now has Disney Plus and HBO. They all have their OTT platforms that are giving Netflix a significant competition, right? So this is the whole area around the core business model being disrupted, and here are some examples, right? But then there are other areas as well where we see disruption, right? There's the perspective of disruption from a geographic vantage point of view. What do I mean by this? Local competitors or local players that have a more intimate understanding of the local needs that are disrupting the large big tech players, right? So for example, a few years ago when Kareem introduced ride-hailing here, it did exceptionally well, right? That's why Uber picked up Kareem, right? Or for that matter, look at Noon, right? Noon is still competing very well with Amazon in the region, right? So you have the second big category, which is the geographic vantage point. And then the third area, which is probably not what, the direction of your question, but it's unfortunately the reality is in some markets there is, regulatory constraints that are causing disruptions to the big tech. For example, China, and I will pause my comments there.
Well, you actually led to my next question, which was going to be, is there enough disruption? So I don't know if we need to stick on China, but in general, is the atmosphere more disruptive or less disruptive than it might have been 10, 20 years ago? Roberto, do you want to take a stab at this one?
Here in the ecosystem?
Yes, in this region.
Well, I think in this region we have seen the maturity of the solutions we see coming out, the startups that we see in this region is definitely increasing, right? So this region has been historically very much focused on consumer business. We have seen many service delivery apps and stuff like that, popping up all the time. And now we see more B2B startups as well being created, right? So there is a change definitely in the maturity that goes along with many other things that are happening in the ecosystem. One is the availability of more capital, more investments. We have seen the total amount of investments, the number of deals, in the region is definitely increasing. We've seen regulatory aspects as well, how the government here and policymakers are making it easier and easier and opening up in certain industries, and also in general to make it easier for entrepreneurs, founders to establish here. We still see more room to go from a corporate perspective to have more corporates. We've seen the first ones like Etisalat with the Capital. We've seen Sharp Group launching their sort of CVC, VC, EV labs. We've seen Majda Futtaim launching their launchpad. So there is more of the corporates actively participating into this innovation conversation. So the indicators are there. The ecosystem is growing. Is it enough? Is it a lot? Is it? I don't know, right? So definitely there has been more innovation happening. There has been also more consciousness of the need of the mindset that has to change, right? Not just bringing in a copycat of ideas, business models that proved successful elsewhere and adapting for the regional ecosystem. Nothing wrong with that, with the right exit strategy in mind. But at the same time, we see more mindset that is more global, more export, more building products that can scale. Because again, where you start from what people really need, where the needs are, in different industries, in different user experiences, right? So that's where the disruption is definitely coming from. So it's positive message in the sense that we see more of this development, more of this innovation coming also from this ecosystem.
Haider, would you agree with that synopsis on the development in terms of the regional ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the region depends on what we qualify as region over here. But if you, what you have to understand over here is that if we look at a lot of the Western economies, tech came at about the same time as it has come over here, generally the region. And these are younger economies. So if you go into more mature economies, they've, over the course of the last 50, 80, 100, 200 years, they developed some systems that were already running offline. And then with the invent of digital and everything started moving online. So there's more capital required when you go into these markets to build that infrastructure out. And you kind of have to do it kind of at a hyper speed because the tech is already there. The users are there, but some of the underlying things might not be there. And I think that's why I feel a lot of the emerging markets, if I generally speak about, all the way from Morocco, let's say, all the way to Indonesia, Philippines. If you look at this whole belt, you really need capital to come in to build that infrastructure. And generally, that capital, well, I think the GCC is in a very interesting spot right now. There's a lot of excitement and innovation and funding available. But generally, the global trends, what happens in the West, also has an impact. So the question, I guess, going forward is going to be in terms of how much liquidity is going to be available, what kind of capital structures are going to exist, are people going to be willing to invest, and are you investing, frankly, you're going to be investing not for 2-year, 3-year, 4-year returns, you're looking at decades, right? So is there enough in certain spots? Yes. In other spots, not as much. And I think as the world runs out of places where they can, let's just say where you start seeing saturation happening, there's tremendous opportunity in these markets. We work on the ground in a lot of these markets. We know what happens, and I think we look forward to getting more and more people involved and more capital going into these markets to build it out. So, yeah, I think certainly exciting times ahead.
Kaustubh, turning to you here for a moment, talking about, obviously, the issue of funding and capital is a perennial one in startups, but about this notion that top-down, the regulatory environment can help breed a system of innovation and disruption. To what extent is that true, and also how does that apply to the UAE specifically?
I think that's a great question, right? So first of all, I think it is true, right? And we are blessed in this region, and certainly in this country, to have extremely visionary leadership. This is true in UAE, this is true in Saudi Arabia, massive, massive transformations. Now look, what is the role of regulation and government, right? I think the question needs to be broadened a bit, right? What is the role of government at large, right? And of course, regulation also plays a role. But look, you know, the government can play a very large role across all the different levers that are required for innovation to happen and to flourish, right? What the government needs to make sure, and this is happening to a large extent, is, you know, startups and tech players can A, incubate successfully, and B, scale and flourish, right? And so what are these levers, right? Of course, there are, you know, there's the funding, there's, you know, things around infrastructure, there are things around talent, there are things around regulation, and so on and so forth. So let's talk about a few of these, right? So on funding, we already talked about this, Haider talked about this, but you know, maybe an additional perspective on that is there is a ton of institutional money, sovereign money, that is determined, is persistent, and has a long-term horizon, right? You will see a lot of change happening in the region beyond what you're seeing now. The pace of change is only accelerating, right? And we are advising many of the clients in the region on exactly these topics, right? So, you know, be it robotics or be it, you know, metaverse, as was discussed in the previous session, this is happening and there's serious money flowing in. Second, let's talk about, you know, talent. The fact that there are serious efforts being made to make this environment conducive for talent to enter and stay is great, right? The golden visa is a fantastic example, right? Entrepreneurs feel a sense of confidence. They can come here, stay for 5, 10 years, and longer, of course. But there is a sense of, you know, certainty, confidence that is required for both innovators and investors, right? So that's certainly the case. You know, let's talk about, you know, startup programs. You know, there are things around, like, for example, Hub 71, for instance, or, you know, the sandbox from DTech. These are some really good examples where the government is playing you know, a meaningful role to make that happen. And of course, there are the, you know, the very specific regulations, right? Which is also very important to make sure there's confidence in the space, right? And of course, there can be more that can be done, right? You know, the regulators can be even more forward-looking, most markets. And you know, UAE is doing that, right? So for example, the recent launch of, you know, the Virtual Assets Regulatory Authority, right? To regulate this whole Web3 space, which is still fuzzy in most people's minds. It's a great step forward. It gives confidence, it gives comfort, right? And that's exactly what you want. So, you know, in my view, there's a lot that is happening that establishes UAE as a serious contender to be a tech hub for the future. Of course, there are more things that can be done as well.
Roberto, I can see you nodding along a bit there. Your thoughts on the same question?
No, I agree with Kaustubh. I mean, what he's basically describing is the evolution of the ecosystem here. When we talk about an ecosystem, it's multiple stakeholders coming together with the spirit of giving first before taking, because we are not there yet. So it's a nascent ecosystem that is evolving, right? So there are these different aspects that I completely agree with, right? So one is definitely the funding element that we discussed about. One is the availability of support and this network of support around founders and startups, right? Which comes with the ecosystem players, the incubator accelerators. You mentioned some examples, the VCs, the community hubs, government corporates all together, right? So the talent aspect is very important. The regulatory aspect is very important. So we touch base on this. I think the elements, the ingredients in this ecosystem are there. They are coming together more and more. in order to raise the bar, I think there are a few things that are still missing. For example, the way we measure success. Probably we should start from there, because how do you measure the success of an ecosystem, right? So I think sometimes we still see what I call the wrong incentives in order to get to the success of where we want to be, right? So for example, the UAE is doing an amazing job in attracting talent, in attracting startups, but one thing is attracting, one thing is also retaining. So we should probably have a serious conversation about how to retain the talent and not only to attract. Or for example, how do we measure the success of startups, incubators, accelerators? It cannot be only the number of startups that is an enabling factor, but it should also be the maturity and the quality of those startups. And it ties with incentives. Why? If I give an incentive like some of these players do, like housing allowance or insurance, for example, right? So fine, but why not having incentives that tie to the growth of the startup? Because this is what you want to see, because then you make everything else a consequence. Because if the startups you attract and you retain, they grow, they will create more jobs. They're growing, they're increasing the quality and the maturity, and they're doing more business and blah, 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 right? So it's all interconnected. So I think we are at this stage where we need to raise the bar. A lot has been done in order to bring these stakeholders together. More has to be done, and is going to be done, in order to raise the bar, in order to increase the quality, in order to retain more of the talent and not just attract and move ahead, right? So I'm positive about that, but we need to be conscious. We also need to have conversation about how to make that happen.
How do you go around creating that collaborative atmosphere that's necessary? And I'm talking here, obviously, specifically about the UAE. Haider, obviously, you've been in the startup system here. Tell me, how do you go about breeding that kind of collaboration?
Look, so I think just one point to add to the previous, and I think they covered a lot of things. I think as a startup, it's very, very important to realize success, right? And what do I mean by that? I have my own measure of success, which has a lot more to do with users and are they actually finding. But investors have a measure of success, which is what are the returns for the money that they put in. And I think there's a lot of work going on at a very, very fast pace if I talk about DFM or ADX, right? And because ideally you would want to list a company that started over here, not somewhere else in the world. Because these markets understand what you're doing, people are familiar with the product, they know the brand. So I think that is as you've recently seen, with the announcement, well, Diva listed, and then there's TCOM coming in. And I think if there's a path to that, then it kind of really solidifies, even from a framework perspective, I think it will create a lot more excitement around the whole stuff. Now, coming on to your question about collaboration, right? Look, I think, if you're a disruptor, you're kind of on the bleeding edge of change. You're going to change things, and that's why you exist. And so you need full support from the authorities. Nobody knows all the answers. When you're working on something today, maybe something will stick, maybe something won't. But when it does, then you need to be able to have a channel, and that's where I think we found over here in the UAE, the government extremely, and the leadership extremely supportive of that change. Even to the effect of them telling us, go, do what you want to do, and then come talk to us, and we'll figure out a way. So I think that's absolutely critical, because at a very fundamental level, you're trying to change, you're trying to make lives easy, you're trying to change the way people behave and act, and that kind of just having that kind of comfort, knowing that there are people to talk to. There's the Dubai Digital Chamber of Commerce. There's plenty of avenues where you can go and you can actually debate these things, and we do talk about these things, and we talk about all of these kind of challenges. Myself, I'm on the advisory board about talent retention, which I think correctly pointed out, right? It's one thing to bring talent; it's a whole separate thing to keep them around. Your success is not measured so much by hiring the best talent; it's actually measured more by retaining the best talent. So I think there's a lot of work going on. The government is very, very open. The leadership is very, very open. They actually are on the forefront of this, and it's up to companies like us to actually show them the issues that we run into and work with them on solving those. And we need to be very candid and open about these.
That question of talent came up in our last session as well, and I think also goes into some of the points that you mentioned earlier, Kaustubh, as well, about how the UAE is embracing things such as the Golden Visa scheme as well to try and keep those innovators in the country. Broadly, though, when we're talking about collaboration, because this also came up this morning, in the fintech ecosystem, banks have started to embrace this idea of working with fintechs rather than trying to design their own products and create that kind of collaborative atmosphere. That dynamic, but related to the technology sector, are big tech firms in danger of being disrupted, or are they looking to collaborate instead? Kaustubh, perhaps I can give that one to you to start with.
Sure. Look, I think it's collaboration is one, but it's also acquisitions, right? So big tech, they certainly do see value in collaboration. They do see value in the disrupting startups, right? So clearly, each of the big tech players you can talk about, they all have ecosystem plays and dedicated teams that are geared towards partnerships. BCG has relationships with each of them, and we have active dialogue with all of them to see how they can partner explicitly. So, there are conversations, without giving specific names, of some of the big, big tech players, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, all of them, right? How can they collaborate with the local ecosystems, right? So this is at a global level, but also on a local level. So certainly they see the value in that. They see value in also obviously acquiring the startups where it makes sense, and particularly now with with the valuations, etc. I think there's plenty of opportunities. So certainly we do see that this is becoming an important part of their playbook for value creation, and this is going to remain. Right. The other perspective here is, with Web3, for example, there is a big risk for the big platforms to get disintermediated, completely avoided, right? And that's yet another reason for big tech players to have a vested interest in partnerships and ecosystem plays, right? You might just be disrupted by the next wave of innovation, Web3.
That's interesting. The impact of Web3, Roberto, perhaps you could give us a couple of words on that as well.
Yeah, just one comment on the collaboration aspect, and then I'll jump in straight into Web3, because I think collaboration is really key. My experience in working with tech companies, right? So the big tech have a very different way of looking at competition and collaboration than what I call traditional legacy companies. Let me give you an example. When I was at Google, I remember when I joined, we were 10,000 people, right? It's a different beast today. But Larry Page kept, challenging us as Googlers, saying that his role was to focus his team's employees, like Googlers, not to think about competition, because he thought we were at 1% of where we could have been. Right? So one aspect of collaboration is also starting acknowledging that focus on what are your strengths first and build on that, and it's an important aspect of that. The second one is think about what Microsoft did with Satya when Satya moved to the CEO role and how it turned around the company in terms of collaboration. So before, probably Microsoft got to a stage where it was not really well known as a great example of ended up being a collaborative partner to work with. Today is collaborating with companies that were competitors a few years back, right? So it completely changed the perspective. So how do you do that? I think it's about overcoming certain fears when it comes to collaborating, right? So that starts from the very top, from the leadership, and having certain sort of norms of behaviors and living by example to show the way on how to open up the culture, to open up the company, to make the most out of collaboration, which of course it has to be also profitable. So it's not just for the sake of being good or being collaborative. So there are, I think that tech companies have great examples of how to build that, because it's also the way you build the business as a platform upon which this sort of API economy where you expose something as a service and someone else doesn't reinvent the wheel, but build on top of that, and the sum of which is this growth mindset of building new things that are greater than the parts, right? So I wanted just to comment on that. On the Web3, look, it's very interesting. What interests me more about Web3 is, again, the transformation and change that those set of technology will bring within corporate organizations. More than the fancy use cases that we see, probably we've been talking about today, is more what interests me is the infrastructure behind, what is more infrastructural behind the Web3, more of most of the things that we are talking about today. So, for example, is how you build platforms that they change the way you bridge physical and digital, coming together. But on an infrastructural layer, that's the platform upon which is being built as we speak, in terms of that's the thing that might scale and create the next big thing. On top of which there will be many use cases being made available, right? So that's the tech part of it, is how can I build something at scale that becomes a platform and an ecosystem that allows more of the development around it. That was interesting me beyond the hype of many things that we have been
like engineering the next ecosystem.
Yeah.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we can all see the clock timing down in front of us. So I do have one more question for you each before we open it up to our audience for any additional question. And it's very open and broad, so please take it in any direction you wish. Quite simply, how do you engineer for innovation? How do you keep innovation going? Haider, we started at the other end to begin with, so why don't we go this way down the line?
I think, we did. I think we started with kind of the same question, and I'll try to answer it a little bit differently this time. Look, at the end of the day, it's all about, you have to have a very vibrant culture around not being okay with the norm, not being okay with just the average. And for that requires a certain mindset, right? You need to create a culture where people are not just only excited about being in a certain city or being compensated, at a certain level. It has to be more than that. It has to be about impacting, changing things. And I think the older you get, I have enough gray hair now on my head, it becomes easier to understand these things. And it's difficult to help young ones understand this, And so I think that's where, if it doesn't start from the top, and it doesn't bleed through the organization, then it's very, very difficult to get people aligned behind that. And maybe they'll get it in 5 years. These days kids are pretty smart. They do get things a lot faster than perhaps my generation. But if you get them to understand, then they'd be better off for it. Maybe it will take 10 years, but you kind of have to have this constant reminder. And one other thing that I would say, and end with this, which is you have to invest back in people. You have to invest back into the company. And it's, trust me, and I've gone through this kind of over the last couple of years, 2-3 years, where how do you strike that right balance, which is I also mentioned earlier, between innovation, not doing too little, not doing too much, just the right amount to kind of keep moving the needle in the right direction. There are no step functions. You have to go in a straight line, and and understand that it's a battle every day that you need to win, and continue to build on that. Without that, I think it's just companies kind of lose sight, and pretty much set up themselves for failure. So we need that senior leadership. We need more talent at that level as well, to people to come over here and then pass it on to the younger generation. And from what I'm seeing for the new kids that are coming up, they're going to do some amazing things. Personally very excited to see where this goes, but just trying to do my part. Thank you.
Kaustubh, to you?
Look, I think the answer is really it depends, right? I fully agree with everything Haider has said. And in addition to the generational perspective, there is also, are you talking about innovation in a 5-person company, which is, I think, less of a question, right? It's important, but the harder question is, how do you create a massive, large company innovative, right? And we talked a few structural mechanisms at the start, right? You opened with this, but look, I reiterate, it's important to declare innovation as a priority and define it. What does it mean for you, right? And put money where your mouth is. And what do I mean by that? Don't limit yourself by short-term benefits. Think long-term, right? We talked about, at the start again, looking beyond the bend, right? The bend may be 5 years out, maybe 10, maybe 5 years out, but then are you going to prioritize your quarterly or annual results at the expense of long-term sustainability, right? And long-term being able to thrive in the future? And this is a challenge that we definitely see with large corporates, right? So I would say, in addition to the things we already talked about, these are some of the things that are super important. And the last thing I would say is, make sure that culture is there within a large organization. It's easier said than done, right? We have led many agile at scale transformations, digital transformations across companies that are, 50, 100,000 people large. And it can happen, but it requires, bold leadership, and it requires you to follow through. And it's okay to fail, but fail fast, right? I think that's super important to make sure this innovation can sustain in a large corporate.
Move faster and with the right leadership. Roberto, to you for the last word.
Yeah, sure. The way I would look at it from tech experience is the way you would do it is building a culture, but a culture of innovation and experimentation. So is making decisions through experiments, is allowing your people to break rules, not any rules that hold them back, but in a constructive way, breaking those in a constructive way, and run experiments. Like, think about it. Take the CFO role in an organization. Historically, they were the real decision makers, right? So with aggregated data on a periodic period of time, right? So today you have data that is very granular, real time. Every organization changes the way they make decisions? Not really. They can, yes. Do you need to wait to close in the quarter to make a decision or the annual review? No. So are you, as an organization, allowing your employee to fail? Is it an organization or a culture where your people have that safety, where they would make failure or they would dissent, they would raise their hands and have a different opinion, and that's encouraged? Many organizations say so, and then they ended up copying Google, just putting some colors on the walls, and they think, oh, we are like Google. No, it's not, right? So it's a culture. Also because what organizations, most of the times in my experience, fail to do is to align that with the performance management of their employees. So employees are still managed on the time they spend in the company, whether it's home or office today, and not on the autonomy that they give their employee and the outcome that they deliver back to the organization. So all these things are interconnected and are part of the culture that you build. So to me is about building a culture of failure, real failure, that you have an organization that keeps learning out of those experiments, and allow these experiments to happen and making decisions based on that, which it comes from the top because leadership has to empower the organization to have this culture, but it also happens bottom up because you need to have the people that comes to work and feel empowered to do so. So it's the two ways that needs to come together.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for answering my questions. Let's direct ourselves to the floor out here. Do we have any questions from the audience before we wrap up this session? I didn't see any hands up. You must be all tied out after our packed today. So in which case, that just leaves me really to thank you all for joining me on stage. Thank you so much for taking time and speaking to us today.